to the latest Salk Social Studies video. It's a brand new year and time to learn about the United States Civil War that lasted from 1861 to 1865 and killed more Americans than any other war in American history. It was a war that pitted brother against brother, father against son, and tore the nation in half. A civil war is when a nation is at war with itself because it cannot seem to settle its differences by changing laws or elected leaders negotiating terms that both sides can agree upon. Now, just so you know, it might be good to watch this video with your Civil War organizer. Okay? I'll be talking about the causes and the results of the Civil War in this video. And you can watch it, stop it, write down stuff, and watch the video again. And it'll be a great way to get some good, solid work put on there. The timeline that you have, see, pre-Civil War, actual war, and then post-Civil War events will also help you fill this out. Because as this goes, we've got pre, current, and post-war sorts of stuff. Now your job during this Civil War unit is to learn the causes and the results of the Civil War. So doing this will definitely help you to reach that end. Okay? And this video will help that as well, but all these pieces that we're going to be doing in class with the homework and everything, it's going to help you understand those causes and results of the Civil War. People often ask, what was the Civil War all about? And the simple answer is slavery. Southern states wanted to keep the institution of slavery, and they wanted it to be able to spread into the West as states desired. Northern states wanted to put an end to slavery, much like other world powers were doing, including their main competitors of France and England. The northern states also wanted the federal government to ban slavery from expanding into the West. The debate became heated in the 1850s when Minnesota went from being a territory to becoming a state, but it exploded in 1861. A total of 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War, but it saved the nation that we know today as the United States of America. Now that war also successfully freed 4 million people who had previously been enslaved for no other reason than the color of their skin. But how did this happen? Was this always how it was? Slavery's been around for a long time, but slavery based on race is something that had to be invented, which is what the English colonies did throughout the 1600s, so one law at a time. Some of the first colonists to come to the United States, both black and white, came as servants. Now, a servant is required to work for an agreed amount of time in exchange for something like passage to the colonies. A servant might work for 5 or 10 years to pay off their debt, and then they were free to go. But what we see happening in colonies like Virginia throughout the 1600s are laws that begin segregating black and white servants. There were philosophers in Europe who believed that whites were superior to the other races, and there was an over-expanding or an ever-expanding slave trade going on with Africa that the English wanted to further expand. Within a few decades, slavery in the American colonies was defined by skin color, and it was made generational, which means if your mother was a slave, so were you, and for the rest of your natural life. It became an institution that you could no longer get out of or escape from. Now, fast forward to 1776, when the American colonies are declaring and fighting for independence from England. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers and the slaveholder himself, wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights that include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Jefferson owned slaves, but he also struggled with the concept. He called for an end to slavery in the Declaration of Independence. But when Congress edited it, that language was removed and slavery remained. After the Revolutionary War in 1787, when they wrote the Constitution, otherwise known as the Law of Our Land, they didn't include anything in there about slavery. Well, Okay, they did say that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person, but they didn't say anything else about slavery. Even though both northern and southern states were making a lot of money from the slave trade, there was a growing abolition movement in the United States looking to end slavery. Now, our country might have been able to solve the problem of slavery several times near the beginning, but because they didn't, things built up and built up until they exploded in a bloody civil war. Here are some of the steps that led to that war. This will be handy to have at the remaining part of this video, because a lot of this takes you right through there piece by piece. Okay? So, in 1820, Congress passed what's known as the Missouri Compromise. Now, this allowed Missouri to become a slave state and added Maine as a free state, so that there was a balance. You add a free state, you add a slave state, and that way both slave states and free states could not get a majority of the votes in the Senate, because each state gets to send two. It also outlawed slavery north of the 36th parallel. The 36th, except for the state of Missouri, all states that were north of the 36th parallel that would be admitted after 1820 would be free states. Now, slavery, like I said, existed for hundreds of years. Well, slavery itself has existed for thousands of years, but slavery in the American colonies only for hundreds of years. Slaves didn't just sit back and take the abuse. Oftentimes they fought back. In 1831, an enslaved African American man named Nat Turner led the deadliest slave uprising in U.S. history. At least 55 white landowners were killed before Turner was captured and hanged himself. This event, though, this slave uprising, it scared a lot of people, especially in the South, where the slave population was around the same size as the white population. And so as a reaction to that, a lot of the rights that African Americans did have were taken away because of the fear of more uprisings. Politically, things kept getting more and more tense. In 1850, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850, adding California to the Union as a free state. It also made stricter fugitive slave laws, meaning that any African American living in a free state but suspected of being an escaped slave could be returned to a slave without a trial. Books inspired people as well. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman, inspired a lot of people on both sides. Her story was about a slave family that was being separated and their attempt to escape. Now, that book angered a lot of Southern slave owners and raised awareness for the abolitionist movement throughout the North. Here's where things start to get really heated up. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act created two new territories and said that these two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, could allow slavery if the people of that state voted for it. As a result, groups that both supported slavery and groups that opposed slavery sent tons of people into those states with the goal of voting slavery up or down. This angered a lot of people. This became a huge, fierce competition, and the anger that this debate generated led neighbors in some parts of Kansas to kill their neighbors, resulting in an event known as Bleeding Kansas. 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that persons of African ancestry were not citizens and had no legal rights in federal court. In this decision, known as the Dred Scott decision, people began to realize that neither side was willing to back down, and that things would probably have to get much worse before they got any better. Bleeding Kansas was a bloody episode that ended up leading to more. John Brown believed that he could free the slaves at Harper's Ferry. He organized 21 men with the intent of capturing weapons from the southern fort, and their little attempt failed miserably. But the fact that he did it in the name of freedom really angered and scared Southern slave owners. It also invigorated the abolitionist movement in the North and showed people that this argument was probably going to be solved with more blood being spilled. On October 6th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, the first Republican president. Shortly after he won the election, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 2 months later, 7 other states joined with South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. The separation of our nation was now official. Then, on April 12th, in 1861, only 5 months after the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Confederate States of America fired upon, attacked, and captured the United States military base known as Fort Sumter. Amazingly enough, after 2 days of Southern cannons almost continuously firing on the fort, nobody died. It was a bloodless first battle of the Civil War. Nobody had any idea how many more years there were to come and how many would die settling this argument. Remember, that first battle, 0 deaths. By the end of the war, 620,000 deaths. Be sure to read the timeline you were given. You've heard a little bit here in this video about the causes of the Civil War, but your timeline also includes details on the major events and battles of the war. It also focuses on the results of the Civil War. Use the timeline to organize your big Civil War cause and effect paper. Oh wait, you want more? You want more information for that paper? Okay, well let's do a little bonus footage here. So what happened at the end of the Civil War? After 4 long years of fighting, where over 620,000 soldiers were killed, the bloodiest war in U.S. history by far, the South surrendered and the North had to return the country to its previous state. This period of time was known as Reconstruction. The leader of the Southern Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Only 5 days later, Southern supporter and famous actor John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Now, our national constitution was changed 3 times as a result of the Civil War. Congress and the people added the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment made slavery illegal. 2 years later, the people in Congress created the 14th Amendment, which gives equal protection under the law throughout the entire country. It also overturned the Dred Scott decision and gave African American men full rights of citizenship. Sorry, ladies of all races were still not officially considered citizens with voting rights. That wouldn't happen for another 60 years, but that's a different issue we'll talk about later. They also passed the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, giving African American men the right to vote. Things were looking like they were headed on the right track throughout the last half of the 1860s. African Americans were being elected to Congress. They were being elected as mayors and governors and leaders of their areas. But there was a lot of anger from Confederate soldiers. And as a result, they formed a group known as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Now, this organization would terrorize African Americans and whites who supported equal rights for decades. In 1877, the last of the federal troops from the Civil War left the South, saying it's up to the states to uphold the rights of African Americans. The sad news, it wouldn't be until 1957, 80 years later, when President Eisenhower had to send federal troops back into the South to allow the desegregation of schools. That led to the sweeping changes of the 1950s and the 1960s. Stronger laws regarding the rights of African Americans took a long time to pass, and it wasn't until the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Amendments passed Congress in 1964 and 1965 that African Americans had their full rights that they were supposed to have after the Civil War and that they should have had from day one of our country.